Good afternoon and welcome to Montgomery Bell Academy. I'm Brad Joya. I teach English and serve as the headmaster, and I'm very pleased to have this program today. We're just the beneficiaries of some people like the next introducer who have brought our friends to Nashville, and they needed a place to speak, and we were really happy to have them here. And John Dean spoke at Assembly today, so I was really grateful to have them speak to the students. Aubrey Harwell, who is a graduate of MBA, class of 1960, is going to introduce our speakers. Please join me in welcoming Aubrey.
Well, let me first say that I'm a proud graduate of MBA. But as I walk around this campus, Brad, I realize what you have done and the incredible leadership you have provided with David Ingram and others has totally changed the face of MBA. So thank you so very much. I'm glad to be here today for many reasons. I appreciate what this school did for me, for my son, for so many in the community. I appreciate the Ingram family with whom I've had an incredible relationship, and David's our chairman. But I am most proud of the fact that Jim Neal and I were law partners for 40 years, and his role in Watergate was an incredible role, and it provided a platform for his later successes, and it certainly allowed me to ride his coattail. So that's why I'm here. You know, there are those events that occur which transform people and which transform nations. And such events occur in this country in the early 1970s, events that caused a president to resign from office in disgrace and forever changed America. John and Jim and I were talking earlier, and I said, you know, a lot of people don't even know what Watergate was about. They're too young to remember it. So I'm going to talk briefly about that. Richard Nixon was elected in November of 1972 to a second term in the White House with the largest landslide in American history. But his presidency was shattered as a result of a series of events which began with the report of the arrest in June of '72 of 5 men who had broken into the Watergate complex and the Washington offices of the Democratic National Committee. As is often true, it was not those acts that transformed the nation. It was not those acts that caused the issues. What transformed the nation was the reaction of those acts carried out by some of the most powerful men in government, including President Richard Nixon, a former Attorney General, and very high-ranking White House staff. The reaction involved criminality at the highest level of government. Recorded conversations in the Oval Office with President Nixon and senior members of his staff about a cover-up, about obstruction of justice and the Watergate break-in, are part of the tsunami that changed our American country. In March of '74, a special Watergate prosecutor indicted 7 former Nixon aides, including White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, senior aide to the President, John Ehrlichman, and former Attorney General, a close friend of the President, John Mitchell. They were charged with a conspiracy to obstruct justice in connection with the Watergate cover-up. Perjury was also charged. The House of Representatives voted to authorize impeachment proceedings against Nixon for obstruction of justice in that matter. In August of '74, with incredible pressure from government, incredible pressure from the media, incredible pressure from the public, Nixon released smoking gun tapes with his voice, clearly indicating he was involved in discussions about a cover-up from the Oval Office, thereby forcing his retirement. August 9, he resigned from office. September 8, he was pardoned by then-President Gerald Ford. The Watergate trial began on October 14 of '74. The jury came back January 1 of '75. All but one defendant were convicted. Jim Neal, who was not only my friend and my law partner, but more like a brother to me, was the chief trial counsel in the Watergate case. The witness on whom he relied heavily and who he came to like and respect was White House counsel John Dean. John Dean became White House counsel to the President in 1970 at the age of 31. He was the heart of power in the United States for almost 3 years. He saw and heard a great deal that occurred in the Oval Office, and he was aware of the misconduct of senior officials in our government. Jim Neal went on to say he was one of the most credible witnesses he'd ever seen, and that John had a photographic memory. He was brilliant, and his recall could not be shook on cross-examination. The program tonight is not going to be focused just on Watergate, but about current events as well. I think that we're incredibly fortunate in Nashville to have two men who are going to give you perspectives of history and present. I would ask that you welcome lawyer, presidential scholar Jim Robinault and John Dean.
Thank you, thank you. My, look what happened there. Isn't that interesting? See if I can get out of that.
Well, good evening. My name is Jim Robinault. I am a lawyer in Cleveland, Ohio, and I've also written 3 books on the American presidency, the latest of which is January 1973, Watergate, Roe v. Wade, Vietnam, and the month that changed America forever. John and I have been doing this program for lawyers. It's an ethics program since 2011. And little did we know back then when we started that we'd be sitting here today with all of these people around the country writing about comparisons between Richard Nixon and Donald Trump.
Incidentally, that's a regular thing I do, is drop my iPhone on this pad so Jim can start.
But how many people here are here tonight because you do want to hear a little bit about comparisons between Nixon and Trump? Good. Well, we've got a good program. You can also help us tonight because we are developing this just as the Trump presidency is developing. We know some things, we don't know everything. And so we're going to ask you if you agree with some of these comparisons, because as we go around doing this program now, we're asking audience for participation so we can get a feel for whether people agree with what we see and what we don't see. So
Thank you,
I'll
Jim.
turn it over to you.
I apologize, we're back up and rolling. I told the students a story this morning I've got to share with you all. First of all, how many here watched the Watergate proceedings? Well, we know your age, and it was a little
Most
older
of
than
you were
the
just in
little
kindergarten,
older than the students this morning. But what happened is I saw a clip that I used this morning, and it reminded me I changed glasses. I went to these little reading glasses because I had cataract surgery. I don't know if you've had that yet or not. It's something I always thought with fear, but it's terrific. I now can see better than 20/20. But when I went to these glasses, I was going through LAX, this just a couple of years ago, and so I flashed on this morning, and this guy came up to me, and he kind of looked at me 2 or 3 times, and then he finally said, and I'll never forget what he said or the way he said it, "Didn't you used to be Dick Cheney?" But the kids didn't get that this morning. What we're going to do is tell you why we're here, and we're going to start with Watergate and try to explain and fill in a couple gaps that our gracious introduction missed. What was Watergate? Obviously, it started as a break-in, and that's the scene of the crime right there, and literally, it's an exhibit from the original Watergate trial. The Democratic National Committee is located in that center building of the Watergate complex. The Howard Johnson across the street, the white building, is now about to come down. It was Howard Johnson sold it to GW. It's been a dormitory for years, but it's where the burglars set up their listening devices to hear what was going on across the way. They were arrested going in to repair a defective bug they had put in, and they were found behind that glass partition, 5 men in business suits. And when the police told them to stand up and come out with your hands in the air, they all were wearing surgical gloves, which the police realized right away that this was something amiss. I've always kind of been fascinated by this exhibit because I saw it first on June 18th. If you look right here, the newspaper people knew much more than we did at the White House. And here was the whole layout, as well as the men who'd been arrested they had very quickly. I happen to have been in Manila, which is about as far across the planet as you can get at the time the crime occurred.
Allegedly. Allegedly. So we got this picture of him coming back.
This was my first mistake, though, coming home. Anyway, realized very quickly, it didn't take me long to put together what had happened, that the committee to re-elect had gotten way beyond what it was supposed to do to re-elect a president. They were all out in Beverly Hills, where I happen to live now. But just in fact, my favorite neighborhood restaurant is in this hotel. They were at a fundraiser. John Mitchell, who was the head of the campaign, the president's former attorney general, and really best friend. If Nixon has best friends, nobody was closer to him than John Mitchell. And as Jim has gotten himself seeped in this material, initially like he was preparing for a trial, he started listening to these tapes, sometimes with fresh ears, and I think he realizes what is not well realized. One of the reasons Nixon gets involved in the cover-up is not because of any direct liability or responsibility for the Watergate break-in, but rather because he's figured out his friend John Mitchell, who he's encouraged to come to Washington and serve as Attorney General when he didn't want to, is in trouble, and he's protecting him. I got my first cue as to what was going on when I came back from the Philippines and read the morning paper on June 19th, on Monday, and it was a little statement here that kind of was a cue. It said, in a statement issued in Los Angeles, Mitchell and McCord said McCord, who was the security officer at the re-election committee, and the other 4 men arrested at the Democratic headquarters Saturday, were not, quote, "we're not operating either in our behalf or with our consent in the alleged bugging." You know,
Which was a complete lie.
a complete lie. Jim does not have, sometimes we have a monitor and he has advanced knowledge. We just kind of assembled this program just for you all to give a quick review. So he'll jump in. We're practiced at interrupting each other, and he'll correct me if I get anything wrong, because he's now studied it long enough to know. Anyway, I become seeped in the thing on the 19th, a series of calls that came in very quickly. That's literally my call sheet. Probably the most important call was from John Ehrlichman, the middle one there, who I told I had understood from Jeb Magruder, who'd called me, that this was Gordon Liddy's responsibility. Magruder said, however, he couldn't talk to Liddy about it and asked me to talk. And Ehrlichman said, well, what's that all about? And I said, I'm not sure, other than the fact that Magruder said he and Liddy had a little bit of an outing. Jeb was on his way to play tennis, ran into Liddy at the elevator. Liddy was the general counsel of the Finance Committee, and Jeb said, Gordon, you owe me a memo, and I haven't seen it. Would you get it over here? And he said, in a very friendly gesture, Jeb explained this to me, I put my hand on Liddy's shoulder. He said, Liddy looked at me with the most hateful eyes. I'm repeating this story to Ehrlichman, and he said to Jeb, Jeb, if you don't take your hand off my shoulder, I'm going to rip your arm out of the socket and beat you to death with it. And he said, John, the way he said it, I think he was actually serious. So you get a little picture of Magruder and his relationship with Liddy.
By the way, we use this as our example with lawyers of crisis management. You know, this is the way crisis happens. The first thing is you're flooded with information. Here's John, like a priest going around the White House, taking all of everybody's confession, trying to figure out what's going on. He knows some things. He doesn't know a lot of things, and he's meeting with everyone, getting all this information. And this is what happens in crisis. As a lawyer, you've got to gather all this information, and it's going to be incomplete, and you've got to make decisions, and then the die is cast. As John said, there's a great tape on the 21st of June where Nixon is talking to his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, And he said, we should really get it out. He's told that Liddy and these other guys for his committee to re-elect had done the burglary. He knows it. He's the president of the United States. He's the chief law enforcement guy in the United States. He doesn't pick up the phone and say, I know who did it. Instead, they talk a little bit. And he said, we should really just put it out there, because the truth has a way of coming out. Eventually, it'll come out. This is Richard Nixon, 4 days after the Watergate break-in. And then he said, but if it's going to involve Mitchell, his good friend, then we're not going to do it because it would destroy him. And that's how Watergate happened, and the die was cast within those first few days.
Actually, over the weekend, after the arrest, the die is really cast. We know so much more than when Jim Neal tried the case today, because today all of the tapes are available. Every single Nixon conversation on this subject that was recorded. It's something like approximately 1,000 conversations. The last book I did, The Nixon Defense, I had a team of 4 to 5 grad students, and first of all, I cataloged all of the statements which hadn't been done and found out maybe 500 had rough drafts prepared. Found another 600 conversations I'm sure nobody outside the archives had ever heard. From those 4 million words we gathered over a 4.5-year period, drew out the narrative and dialogue. So there's virtually nothing about this event that isn't known.
And you can tell them about your great fear listening to all those tapes.
Well, it's a fear that was realized. I told my wife, Maureen, to whom I'm still married.
That got a round of applause.
Yeah,
this
I was
morning.
glad the students applauded that this morning. Maybe that's the exception to the rule down here in Nashville. I don't know. But anyway, Mo and I are still married, and I was telling her during this project, I said, the men in my family during our 70s tend to lose our hearing. And I said, God forbid the last voice I hear is Richard Nixon's. It didn't, but it finished off my hearing. Anyway, on the 19th, Ehrlichman tells me to go ahead and meet with Liddy and find out what in the world happened. So I had Liddy come over to my office. Liddy's an odd fella. He sort of thinks he's James Bond. Now that I've studied him, I realize he's really not quite at the Maxwell Smart level. But I had him come over, and I was officed in the executive office building, a magnificent building that's beside the White House, inside the White House grounds. And I cut him off rather than to come in. And he confessed to me. He told me that it was Magruder's fault, that Magruder had pushed him to doing this, that his men had gone in for the second time, that he apologized for using the chief of security at the re-election committee, James McCord, but he said Magruder had cut his budget so badly he had no option. That he says, my men are soldiers, they won't talk, but we got to get them out of jail. He claimed commitments were made for bail, support money.
That becomes one of the cover-up problems. It's called hush money. You pay people to keep them quiet. We'll talk about that a little later.
Yeah, and we go, we do a 3-hour session on this, we'll do tomorrow for lawyers, where what we did, as Jim and I, he had just come back from a CLE, a continuing legal education program in Ohio, and I said, I get invited to these all the time, Jim, and they don't know what to do with me. I've thought about putting together my own program. Are you interested? He and I had known each other well enough to know I knew how skilled and talented he was and a good student of these subjects, plus a true history buff. And I said, why don't we put together our own program? And I wanted him to look at the primary source material, to really get to know. It literally took 6 months to put the first program together, and it's evolved a long way since then. He's actually written a book on the subject as well. But it's a difficult subject and a complex subject, but we've tried to take the problem that some 21 lawyers got on the wrong side of the law, and the fact that out of my testimony emerged the ABA's new model code of professional responsibility, and see what would have happened had those rules been in existence back there and there been any pretense to try to follow them. It really has some interesting results, and that's what our program is about tomorrow. But let me go on with Liddy's confession to me. Probably the most important thing he told me, because I thought the White House had really no problem at this stage, is that Liddy, while working at the White House, had used two of the men who were now in the D.C. jail to break into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office after the Pentagon Papers were leaked.
How many people know that Ellsberg?
Yes. For
So
those
for
who
the
don't,
younger people, yeah.
for those who don't, he was an anti-war activist. He once had been a supporter of the Vietnam War. He'd been a Marine. He'd been in service in Vietnam, but turned against the war and thought he could solve the war by releasing a study of the war that had been done at the Pentagon to show the origins of the war. And Ellsberg's point was that every president from Truman on had lied about Vietnam to the American public. And he was convinced if he put that out, the public would turn.
So it's the original WikiLeaks for those of you younger. Not
The
quite Julian Assange, but
yes. So here were two of the men, and I didn't know it at the time, but I would learn that the break-in had been authorized by my predecessor at the White House, John Ehrlichman, who had been White House counsel and had moved on to become the assistant to the president for domestic affairs. Anyway, this is what Liddy's concern is, that the two of the men he used in the Ellsberg break-in are now in the jail, in the D.C. jail.
so Liddy had been working at the White House for a group called the Plumbers. And just like today, with all this concern about leaks, Nixon was concerned about leaks back at the time. And so that's why they were called the Plumbers. They were going to stop leaks. And that's why John has a problem as a lawyer, because now this guy's confessing crime he did while he was in the White House, not just at the committee to re-elect. So now you've got a true problem on your hands.
I do, but we're not teaching a CLE, so we'll go on with the narrative. As Gordon is finishing up with this horror tale, which incidentally, Jim Neal loved this line and used it throughout the trial, that John Mitchell, when he later testifies, calls the White House horrors, and they were indeed. Anyway, after laying this on me, we're walking back up 17th Street. Gordon stops me and says, "John, I realize I've made terrible mistakes. I've created an enormous problem for the White House. And I understand that if anybody wants to shoot me, you just tell me which street corner to be on and what time to be there." I said, "Well, Gordon, we haven't reached that stage yet." Might have been another mistake, I'm not sure. Anyway, I take the report back to Ehrlichman to tell him what has happened. I'm sure he was unhappy with all the information I had accumulated, because I will learn much, much later. In fact, this won't come out until Watergate is really disintegrating and imploding on itself, that John Ehrlichman had authorized the Ellsberg break-in in writing in a memorandum asking for his approval, with the line, "with your assurance that it's not traceable to the White House," in his handwritten, leaving the trace right to himself. As was explained in the introduction, we go from the break-in on June 17th of 1972 through January 1 of 75, when the jury comes back with the guilty verdict against Haldeman, the Chief of Staff, Mitchell, the former Attorney General, Ehrlichman, the former White House counsel and assistant to the President for Domestic Affairs. That's actually 925 days of scandal, with varying waves of interest by the media. At first, almost no interest. Not until everybody is fired on April 30th of 1973 does the media really jump on the story. Other than the Washington Post, there's almost no attention. The first definition I ever saw of Watergate was in a Beverly Hills bookstore where I live, describing it as a scandal involving abuse of presidential power during the presidency of Richard Nixon, which tells us very little about that sad chapter. But part of that chapter really involved a lot of Nashville lawyers in resolving it. Faces that are familiar to some and have sadly passed. Howard Baker, who was your senator.
By the way, on Baker, very quickly, when John was White House counsel, one of the things he did was vet Supreme Court candidates. And we do a whole program on this. And Howard Baker was offered a seat on the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. And he fretted about it because he worried he wouldn't be able to make enough money.
That's right.
On the court.
He still had children to send to school. He tried it out. He went over and saw Potter Stewart, who was a sitting justice, spent the day with him in the Supreme Court over in his chambers to see how he thought about it and felt about it. And then he just disappeared. The White House, he'd been offered the job, and he disappeared. We couldn't find him to vet him. I was in charge of the vetting process at that point, and it was mysterious. We didn't know what had happened to him. Meanwhile, I happened to suggest another name because I knew Nixon was struggling to find somebody who was a true conservative. And I said, you know, if you're looking for somebody who understands their conservatism, there's a guy over at the Department of Justice when I was the Associate Deputy Attorney General over there and arranging for people to testify on Capitol Hill. I said, there's one person here who really understands every conservative thought he's ever had. A fellow by the name of Bill Rehnquist. Bill was running the radar machine to read the opinions of people who were being suggested as Supreme Court caliber. He'd been a former law clerk to Robert Jackson after graduating #1 in his class at Stanford. John Ehrlichman was in that class, but was not in the top 10. Right. But still liked Bill.
So is Sandra Day.
And I said, if he wants a conservative, that's it. And I kind of dropped that in there just to see what would happen. And it got the president and a couple other staffers' attention. So while Howard Baker was dithering and trying to decide what to do, Nixon falls in love with Bill Rehnquist. And we have the recordings, because I did a book on this called The Rehnquist Choice, and he tells Mitchell, well, withdraw the offer from Baker. He's waited too long, and now I want to do Rehnquist. So that was a fleeting moment of fame here for your city.
It really incredible moment because in the tape, Nixon calls Mitchell, and Mitchell says, you know, have you talked with Baker? And he said, yeah. He said yes. He finally said yes. He goes, well, can you turn him off? He said, I don't know, after just asking him. He said, well, let me think about it. And then there's 17 seconds where history is made in this tape. And he says, well, I think I'm going to go with Rehnquist. Tell him, you know, we're going to move on. And that's how history is really made. Rehnquist will, between Berger and Rehnquist, 2 Nixon appointments, they will dominate the court as chief justices for 37 years. So if you don't think those appointments aren't important, think about what happened in that instance.
Another Nashville lawyer, of course, was Fred Thompson. I'm looking at that amazing head of hair on Fred at that time. Here's a different head of hair he had when he was in the Senate. I actually liked Fred. I got to know Fred. We started meeting in green rooms. I at one point actually said when he was out of the Senate, but he was helping George Bush get, I think it was Roberts on the court. Anyway, that was his assignment, was to help shepherd people through the process in the Senate. And I ran into Fred in a green room, and I said, Fred, I said, you know, I think somebody ought to float your name out there as somebody for the next opening that occurs on the bench. He said, God, John, don't say that. Don't even think that. I said, why not? He said, I'm finally making some real money again. And he said, I can't go on the court. Anyway, I wanted to give him a send-off. Of course, here's Jim Neal with Rick Benveniste and Jill Vollner.
How many people here knew Jim Neal? Isn't that great? That's a lot of people.
I'm actually doing a little program tomorrow at the law firm where I found some footage of Jim that I don't think anybody has seen. But if you're interested, Google the District of Columbia Historical Society. They did a program a good while ago, and it was, I think it was 2004 is the best I can figure out exactly when it is. And if you Google the Historical Society, they have a program, and they have public programs, and this was the first of a series of programs. I'll give you that specific URL later. Anyway.
But think about one thing. Think about the impact Nashville had on Watergate. You got Howard Baker. What did the president know, and when did he know it? You got Fred.
Incidentally, that's a question he asked me, and he didn't ask it trying to draw out information. He was trying to perjury trap me or narrow down my testimony, and I recognized immediately how effective what he was doing really was. He was trying to pin me down, and I don't know if I'm sure he didn't know there was a taping system. Fred Buzzhart, the White House counsel handling Watergate at that point, did know about the taping system. So they were trying to pin me down with the thought that they would nail me at some point.
Yeah, and so then you got Fred Thompson, who asked Alexander Butterfield, Mr. Butterfield, was there a taping system? And that changes everything. Of course, they found that out.
He got to ask the question because one of his deputies, a fellow by the name of Saunders, had actually popped the question. I had testified to the fact I thought I was recorded, for good reason. First of all, Nixon had bragged at one point that he could prove I'd said something in a conversation to another member of Henry Peterson, a fellow at the Department of Justice. And it was raised with my lawyer. I said, well, you know, I think there's a likelihood they did record that conversation. I testified. In fact, Howard Baker quizzed me on this extensively. He said, why do you think you were recorded? I said, well, at one point, we're on April 15th in a conversation with Nixon. First of all, he takes me through a bunch of leading questions, which was very unlike our sessions. And he's not getting the answers he wants. He said, for example, you remember when we were talking about, you were telling me there's a cancer on the presidency, and that these people are going to cost us who knows how much, and I pressed you a little bit and said, well, how much? Well, I at that point pulled out of thin air what I thought was a hefty number that would offend him, and I said it could cost $1 million. And his response was not what I expected. That's about $5.5 million today. He said, I know where we can get that. And he reminded me of that answer, and he said, you know, when I said that, of course, I was just joking, didn't you? This is on April 15th, and I said, well, Mr. President, I didn't know you were joking. Next thing he does, he gets up and goes off to the corner of the office, and he says in a stage whisper, he said to me, I was foolish to talk to Chuck Colson, another White House aide, about clemency for Howard Hunt, one of the organizers of the break-in. And I said, yes, Mr. President, that was probably an obstruction of justice. Well, at that moment, it clicked that he was recording the conversation, clearly didn't want that on the recording, so he'd stepped away from wherever the microphone was to get that information. So there are a lot of reasons I thought, and of course, Doug Sanders asked the question of Alex Butterfield on my lucky day, Friday the 13th of July. Friday the 13th is when I met my wife. Friday the 13th is when we got married. So it's a day that's always been important to me.
So you've got Fred Thompson doing that, and then you've got Jim Neal doing everything that he's doing with this group that under Archibald Cox, you know, they developed this incredible record that they can turn over to the investigating committees too. So
right.
Nashville had a huge impact on Watergate.
Anyway, the session we're actually going to do tomorrow, Jim, talk a little bit about how we came down and selected executive power in dealing with crisis.
All right, so as we started today, I asked you about, these comparisons between Nixon and Trump. It's happening everywhere. John's on television now on CNN on a regular basis talking about it. I get asked about it all the time. And what we want to do is tell lawyers, the first thing you got to realize when you're dealing with your clients, where it's an organization, is you represent that organization. And sometimes you have to represent that organization against the very people who are running the organization. Really difficult thing, but you represent the company. In John's case, he represented the office of the presidency.
Well, at that time, it was not clear. It's really post-Watergate that they clarify that today, Don McGrath, who is White House counsel, does not represent Donald Trump. He represents the office of the president that Trump just happens to occupy. So that's a big change.
So what you have to be careful about is, the people running these things are human beings, and they all have biases, and they all act in ways that are sometimes very predictable, like cover-ups. They are very predictable if you know the psychology of cover-ups and what's going on. And so you have to understand their traits. So, you've got to be this objective observer. You've got to understand what it's like to deal with difficult personalities. That's not a political statement, by the way. So compare and contrast. We look at these two.
Incidentally, I found this, and no question who has the bigger thumb.
Yeah.
And Nixon's smaller. He's not as tall. Little hands.
All right, so striking similarities. All right, so we've got, both used, now think about this, both of them used very turbulent times to bring in a counter-revolution. All right, Nixon did it because of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. It created all this tumult, and people reacted to it. It's a counter-revolution. It's reaction to what's going on. This is not my country. I want to get back to my country. Same thing just happened with Donald Trump, and we'll talk about that. But John, you lived through these times of what Nixon was doing, and you also have studied authoritarians.
Yeah. The late Senator Goldwater, who I talked about this morning, his son and I have been lifetime friends. We were roommates together at a institution not too dissimilar from this, and when the senator retired, at one point he was very upset with the religious right and the influence they were having on the movement he started, which he thought should really not incorporate be a religious movement in any way. So he got into some pretty good public disputes with people about that. And he said, I'd like to do a book. And he said, John, if you'd help me, I'd be, I've got the time, and maybe you could make the time. And so we started on a book which we would call Conservatives Without Conscience. And unfortunately, the senator's health gave out. I could tell. I talked to Barry Jr. I said, is your dad really should not be spending time and doing other things? He said, yes, he shouldn't be working on this book. So I eased out of the project and put it on the shelf, and came back years later and found there's a whole body of science on something I didn't know anything about called authoritarianism. And
one of the things John and I both have concluded from our study of the presidency is that Richard Nixon and Donald Trump are two authoritarians who've been in the office, and the last one we can think of is really Woodrow Wilson.
But look at the traits of an authoritarian dominator. I wrote this in 2006. Typically men dominating, opposes equality, desirous of personal power, amoral. Those are the four essential elements that the social scientists put people in this category with. But they say they also may or may not have the following traits and dispositions: intimidating and bullying, faintly hedonistic, vengeful, pitiless, exploitive, manipulative, dishonest, cheats to win, highly prejudiced, racist, sexist, homophobic, mean-spirited, militant, nationalistic, and tells other what they want to hear, takes advantage of suckers, specializes in creating false image to sell self, may or may not be religious, usually politically and economically conservative. It's a pretty interesting list when you look around today.
Okay,
Excuse me,
so,
Jim.
well, as we were saying, Nixon comes out of this tumult from the 1960s, beware the counter-revolution. This is something that I wrote about in my book about some people who wrote, like the authors Nixon and Colson, foresaw the massive transformation that was taking place in the national politics in reaction to the excesses of the New Deal, the Great Society, and the social chaos churned up by the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. Well,
You sound like a professor there.
yeah, I do. So the same thing just happened here, and I think this explains. Now, this next list is my own list of why we had backlash politics, and let's, by show of hands, just say if you agree with this or not, that this is a reason we had backlash. The first one is, mine is African American president. Okay, that's a pretty good number. Clinton elitism is another reason that we had it. That server is not about disclosing national secrets. It's about I'm above it all. The elitism played into that. Greater social programs for the poor. Obamacare is another big reason that we had it. Gay marriage, which really was not talked about a lot, but I think under the surface had a huge impact. We always have this, but I think we had it again in this, the abortion debate in this country. And when I wrote about Roe v. Wade in my book, it was about how that came about and how it wasn't all that controversial in '73 when it passed, and it became a major issue and litmus test for Supreme Court. Government growth is another reason people were upset. International trade, for sure, we see that. Immigration and terrorism, obviously that was a big theme. And
we found a couple other very real examples where the candidates, or now the former president and president, speak for themselves. Here is one that I found very striking. Listen to this.
And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace. I have initiated a plan of action which will enable me to keep that pledge. The more support I can have from the American people, the sooner that pledge can be redeemed. For the more divided we are at home, the less likely the enemy is to negotiate at Paris.
Hugely popular speech. People felt like they weren't being heard, like their voice was not being heard. Did Trump take any cue from that?
Hold on just a second. Hold on just a second. What happened, I looked at the numbers last night. About a third of the public reacted. Nixon pretended like about 50% of the public had reacted. This is a sham right here that was set up to look like all these wires and telegraphs had come in to the Oval Office when they were all staged to come in to the Oval Office. Here's Trump. Turn to Trump.
Okay, so let's look at Trump looking at this same thing. Do you realize that he started his campaign a month after he announced that he would run, coming down the gold escalator? A month later, he was in Phoenix, and we just saw him there recently, and he said this in Phoenix.
Thank you. It's a term that I haven't heard for years, but I really think it applies now more than maybe ever before, and that's the term, the silent majority. Have you all heard that? You don't hear it anymore. You don't hear it. When people start cutting up their credit cards at Macy's and won't go to Macy's anymore, when all of these things, and that's a big story, but nobody wants to write it, that's fine, I don't care about me. But when you see the kind of power that the silent majority has, and the silent majority is a problem. They want to go out, they want to lead a good life, they want to work hard, they want to have their family, they don't want to be involved in coming here and waiting on a line for hours and hours and coming in and listening to Trump. But the silent majority is back, and we're going to take the country back.
How many people connected that up, those two dots? Not many, but it was important, and it's his theme, that the people were not being listened to. So that was a big part of a comparison here.
Jim, let's move faster because you have to go at very shortly to do a break. Listen to this.
The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The establishment is the enemy. The professors are the enemy. The professors are the enemy. Write that in the blackboard 100 times and never forget it.
That's an actual tape.
I don't think Henry ever did write it down 100 times on a blackboard.
And by the way, he was a Harvard professor, too.
But we also know who is talking about the media being an enemy today. It's very similar language.
Attacking intelligence agencies is another thing.
Very similar in attacking intelligence agencies. I want to get to another slide down here where we just look at characteristics and traits that I've pulled out that I think are very Nixonian, and we want the audience to help us with Mr. Trump. I think Nixon was a very insecure person. You listen to many hours of conversations, far exceeding any single person's time with Nixon in the Oval Office. He's certainly an authoritarian and certainly was a bully. Behind closed doors, not out in the open, but rather a private bully where he would demand his aides do things in his names. He disliked elites. He never felt that he had the same breaks that others did, and he was very resentful about it. He sought revenge of his enemies. One of the most amazing things that might have happened in a second Nixon term is I don't think there's anybody in Nixon's life that he'd ever forgotten if they'd given him a slight, and he was going to get after them and use the machinery of the federal government to go after them in his second term. It's really quite striking. I put some of it in the book, not a lot of it, because it just is so redundant. He feared losing. Resigning was probably the hardest thing the man ever did because it was admitting loss. He lied easily, but tended to lie only about big issues and got caught in them. It's really getting caught in the lie that cost him his presidency when the so-called smoking gun tape surfaces after the Supreme Court orders him to turn over the tapes. It's not that it showed obstruction of justice, which it did, but it also showed that he'd gone to people like the minority leaders, the minority leaders and the Republican leaders in the House and Senate and looked them right square in the eyes and said, I was not involved in the cover-up. Just as I've told the public, the first I learned of the cover-up is when John Dean came in and told me on March 21st there was a cover-up. Didn't know about it. Well, it was an outrageous lie, and the smoking gun tape put the lie to him because it showed he was involved in getting the CIA to interfere with the FBI's investigation within 6-7 days of the arrests at the Watergate. So he had at that point even personally be embarrassed at what he told people. He did easily cover up mistakes, and he blamed others. Jim, why don't you take the next?
Okay, so
this is your test in the audience.
Right, so this is where we want show of hands, and it's seriously, if you don't want to participate, don't. But do you agree that he's insecure? That's interesting. Okay. Authoritarian bully, even more. Okay. Dislikes elites. That's about the same. Seeks revenge on enemies. Yeah, that's pretty universal. Fears losing. That's why he talks about winning all the time. Lies easily. That's a lot. Covers up mistakes. Blames others. Same people raising their hands. Okay. Dirty campaigner. And by the way, you know, there's this, I just wrote a piece in the Huffington Post the other day about the pardon of Sheriff Joe as, is this a signal to people who are being investigated by Mueller to know that they don't have to worry about it and that they should keep their mouth shut? There's an extremely interesting tape that we're going to talk about tomorrow where John is talking with Nixon. Nixon had promised Howard Hunt through his lawyer that he would get clemency if he pled guilty and didn't go to trial, and a year afterwards he would let him out of jail. And so Hunt does do that. He pleads guilty, and that's on tape. And then the Cubans, the burglars, take the cue, and they also plead guilty and keep quiet. So it's interesting. And then John gets to the point where Nixon, he says, you know, I just don't think you could do it. I don't think you could pardon these guys. This is why we've got to stop this cover-up right now. It's just going to be too hot. And Nixon says, you're right, John, it would be wrong for me to do that, to use the pardon power in that way. So a lot of interesting parallels. Whether that's true or not today, we don't know, but a lot of interesting parallels.
Jim has a pre-existing commitment that he made before we started tonight, so I'm going to excuse him to honor his commitment, and I'm going to go forward and continue this, and then open. And Jim also says no one ever asked me any questions, so.
once we get to the Q&A. So thank you very much.
One of the things that we like to have very core to our continuing legal education programs, that is so much broader than for lawyers, is the consequence of hating to lose. It's the big takeaway that it was a big discovery for me to even learn about it. When I happened to be doing, the American Bar Association invited me up to Boston for the ABA section on professional responsibility when they got wind that Jim and I were doing this program, and were kind of curious what I was saying and why I was saying it. Before the session started, the night before, there was a panel set up to then kind of offer commentary on what I had to say. And one of the people who's now surfaced as a very public person, who I hadn't met before then, is Richard Painter. I talk to him regularly now. How many have seen Richard Painter on television? He's a consultant on MSNBC very frequently. Very blunt fella. He was George Bush II's ethics counsel. He teaches up at the University of Minnesota in the law school, and he's studied the psychology of cover-up, which I didn't even know there was a field that looked into that subject. Richard was very familiar with countless scandals, but he never really tackled Watergate. He played with it, knew the general pictures of it, and we had a long conversation, and I realized that what he had uncovered explained so much I didn't know about my own behavior, and at the time I was working on the tapes and listening to the behavior of others. He's written a few pieces about it, and I'm quoting from one here, that psychological studies show a person in what's called the loss frame, which I'll explain, often make risk-preferring, get that, risk-preferring decisions in order to avoid a loss, even if the risks they take are irrational. Now, that didn't sound very sensical, but I began looking at the material that he was talking about, and it's really the work of Amos Tversky, who had passed away by the time his partner was given the Nobel Prize for it in 2002 in economics. Unusual for a psychologist to get a Nobel Prize in economics. Anyway, Kahneman had put some of it in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Wonderful book, not a page-turner, but a nice digest of a lot of his studies, as well as his partner Tversky's. But let's look at what he's talking about a little closer. He says that there's a cognitive basis or a frame of reference that we all are confronted with when we're making decisions. We have a mindset about what the situation we're in. And when you're in what's called the gain frame, in other words, things are looking good, the decision makers are risk adverse. You're less likely to take a risk when the picture looks good. I'll have more on that for you in a minute. When deciding between two gains that will result in a gain. In other words, two win-win situations. Just the opposite happens with loss frame. They're risk preferring when deciding between two decisions that result in a loss. Let me explain what this means with a very specific example. Here's a prospect for a gain and a gain frame. A person is confronted with a choice between receiving a sure 1,000 or a 1 in 2 chance of receiving 2,000. They're more likely to take the $1,000. This has been tested and retested and retested. Both these, the loss frame and the gain frame, seem to me to be part of human nature, given the testing that is repeated so consistently. Let's look at the loss frame. Person choosing between a sure $1,000 loss or a 1 in 2 chance of suffering a $2,000 loss is more likely to take the $2,000 risk. This is how casinos make money with this nature. Kahneman says, in short, that your decisions depend on your point of reference. Painter, in applying this again in the loss frame in the cover-up situation, says the legal risk of concealment and the risk that the problem could get worse while it is concealed will be preferred over the more certain cost of prompt disclosure. And I can tell you, not only from personal experience, but from a lot of study, there's only one solution in these cover-up situations, or situations could call for a cover-up, and that is prompt disclosure. There's also another factor that Kahneman and Tversky found at play here. In addition to the fact that we dislike losing so much, and the norm is about, they've quantified it to about 2.3 times more do we dislike losing. We just don't like to lose. But there's also, we tend to have overconfidence and think we can tough it out and make our way through it. Here's Kahneman speaking to that.
We want our leaders to be overconfident. I mean, if they told us the truth about the uncertainty, we would discard them in favor of other leaders who sort of give an impression that they know what they're doing. We want overconfidence. We support it, we sustain it, and there is an awful lot of it. I mean, most of what we read in the paper is overconfidence. Sometimes it's catastrophic. Just about every war that you see, I think that's a general rule, there are optimists among the generals, and there are optimists on both sides. And that is true for a lot of litigation as well. So a lot of conflict is fed by overconfidence. There is an interesting story here of two biases that work in opposite directions. So one familiar, you can call it bias, but is what we call loss aversion. People put a lot more weight on negative events than on positive events, on losses than on gains. So people are loss averse. On the other hand, they're optimistic. And so many of the decisions that people make, especially in starting new businesses, I mean, that is where it's been studied most extensively. So clearly, overconfidence is rife. And overconfidence and loss aversion seem to be acting in opposite directions. From the point of view of the individuals, it is not always good to be optimistic. For example, I have no interest whatsoever in my financial advisor being an optimist. You know, I don't care for that.
On that note, I think we'll end the chat, and I'd really like to open this up for any questions you might have about either what you've seen tonight or that period of history that I probably have more expertise than I really wish I had. But I must say, in the last few years, after going through all those tapes, between that and a lawsuit I filed, which was 9 years in discovery, when a book was released that tried to draw my wife into Watergate, and I said, that's the line we're not going to cross, because she had nothing to do with Watergate. I have become deeply knowledgeable about this subject, so I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. Over here, yes.
You have a hunch whether Trump is reporting conversations?
I didn't hear that.
Do you have a hunch whether Donald Trump is reporting conversations in the Oval Office?
Everybody hear that up in the top? Yes? Top row? You know, I thought about that when all the publicity came out about whether he was recording or not. First of all, the Secret Service, who they go through the building regularly to look for surveillance. That's who put the system in for Nixon, was the Secret Service. They were asked under a Freedom of Information Act request if there was currently any types of recordings going on, and they said no. So there's no system installed. But we're now in the era of smartphones. How easy would it be to put your smartphone up and record a conversation? It's not very difficult. That would be one possibility. But I've never thought that Trump was much different in Nixon in some regards, as not being particularly smooth at that sort of thing. One of the reasons that Nixon had a voice-activated system. By voice-activating, meaning the system would only go on if somebody spoke in the room where the president was. There was the locator that had where the president was in the White House complex. If he was in his executive office, building office, the Secret Service locator would indicate where he was. That would activate also the voice-activated microphones so they would go off. If the cleaning crew was in the Oval Office at night talking, wouldn't go off because the president wasn't there. So it was a very sophisticated system, and the reason it was put in as voice-activated was because Alex Butterfield, in consultation with Haldeman, had decided that they didn't think that Nixon would ever get to his desk like Lyndon Johnson had and hit the switch underneath the desk to turn it on, or he'd leap across the room to do it and everybody'd know what he was doing. He's a man who, I used to watch him with, you know, the medicine bottles you had to press down and turn. He had a lot of trouble with those. I'd see him with them in his mouth trying to get the cap off, and he had trouble literally opening his drawers sometimes. You just kind of wanted to reach up and open the drawer for him. But anyway, so I don't think Trump is doing that sort of surveillance. The telephone on his desk, however, is the same telephone that Obama had. And I looked it up just out of curiosity. And it has the capacity to record calls. All you have to do is press a button for voicemail on that model phone, and the voicemail suddenly becomes a recording device of the conversation. So it's not difficult to record on that equipment he's got. So he may have some telephone calls that are recorded. I don't know the answer, but eventually learn. Question here, yes.
Yeah, in drawing these comparisons, I assume you have some suspicions. What was the suspicions of Trump be?
I don't have any suspicions of Trump. I have a knot in my stomach about Trump. And what it tells me is, first of all, that the first feeling is incompetence. I don't think he has a clue beyond maybe a crude newspaper knowledge of how the presidency runs or how Washington works. He has not surrounded himself with a particularly sophisticated crew initially. He's slowly doing that. His new chief of staff, John Kelly, certainly knows how it works there. And so it's been a little frightening to see the people take over the government who have no real background in how the machinery works. On the other side, Richard Nixon was very knowledgeable about how it worked and knew exactly which levers to go for when he wanted to go for them to do what he wanted to do. I don't know what Trump's authoritarianism will do once he figures out where those levers are, if he does. But that's my concern. He has absolutely no regard for the norms of Washington. And the norms are the guardrails. They're not laws. They're not even written often. They're just understandings about the way the machinery is supposed to work. And he just doesn't care. And I find that disquieting. And that's why I have a knot in my stomach. Yes, sir. The question is whether or not the president could or should have been, Nixon should or could have been indicted as a co-conspirator or simply named as a co-conspirator. I have strong feelings about that. And what first of all, the issue arose when Spiro Agnew, who had been a former governor of Maryland and was Nixon's vice president, was discovered through a Baltimore grand jury to be getting brown sacks filled with cash that had started when he was governor of Maryland, and while he was still vice president, he was getting the bags of cash. Agnew was going to be charged, and Agnew's defense was, you can't indict me, you can only impeach me. This went to the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice, which made a decision, and that is the rulemaking determining factor for such decisions in the Department of Justice. And they, a fellow named Robert Dixon, who was then the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Office of Legal Counsel, made a ruling that no, Mr. Agnew, you can be indicted. It's the president who can't be indicted, and issued a ruling and an opinion in '73, which was stayed in effect until 2000. And in 2000, the new Assistant Attorney General in charge of Legal Counsel issued an updated version, again saying a sitting president cannot be indicted. So that issue has held at least since '73, and is now the existing rule that confronts the special counsel, Mr. Mueller, should he find a crime at that level. He is bound under his appointment to honor the rules and regulations of the department, so Trump cannot be indicted. He can only be impeached if that such conduct was warranted by the investigation of the special counsel. There is a whole group headed by Philip Lacavara, who had worked in the White House, in the Watergate Special Counsel's office, with whom I've had long conversations about this, who makes a very powerful argument that Justice Department is wrong. They are misreading the law and the history as well, and that a president is indictable. In our system, nobody is above the law, including the President of the United States. And Philip Lacavara makes a very powerful case that if this issue comes up, that it should go to the Supreme Court to be decided, rather than just pass off the case to the House of Representatives for an impeachment inquiry, to proceed with an indictment and test it. So we don't have an answer to the question, and you can see arguments on both sides. The president is the only figure in our government that is by himself a branch of government under Article 2. But when nobody really knows how the 25th Amendment works, where a president can be asked to step aside because he's unfit, which he would be if he were under indictment, and the vice president can take over, and all it takes is 2/3 of the cabinet and 2/3 of the Congress to agree, and he can be pushed aside, and the vice president can operate while something like this could be resolved. So we are again in thrilling times, and we might find answers to these questions. Question, please. Yes. could hear that. It was this gentleman had played golf with a prominent Democratic attorney recently, and this issue of whether or not it was maybe Bill Clinton who was responsible for the Trump victory, given his behavior in office. And I've heard that argument, and it's not an unreasonable argument. What I first was reacting to was the fact when you said you'd played golf, and in the context of Trump, I immediately thought of, I have a friend who's played golf with Trump. And he said, we call him Pele. And I said, what do you mean you call him Pele? For those of you who don't know who Pele is, he's a great soccer player. And they said, we call him Pele because he's always kicking the ball. And if you know the rules of golf, you don't kick the ball. It's take the lies as they are. But anyway, I don't know the answer. You know, I think probably with some people that could have been a factor, the Clinton behavior. It was a complex election, and we don't obviously have all the facts. We don't know what impact Russia might have actually had with their hacking. That's still being sorted out in probably the most sophisticated counterintelligence investigation we've had since the end of the Cold War. So I think I'm going to hold back until I see all that evidence. Yes.
Watergate forward, we've seen it and that kind of thing. There were a whole group of you who have been around Nixon for years. What should we have done? And when should we have done it? That there was a problem because a lot of people went to work in the White House, worked for him for the entire administration, and he was not, unlike Trump, was not an unknown figure.
Right.
Yet a lot of people should have a lot of data from an organizational point of view that there was a problem that could have been.
Good question.
What do people miss?
In the back there? Good. When I went to work at the Nixon White House, I literally thought there was a new Nixon. That was part of the campaign back in he had started that really in 70. There was sort of the hint that there was a new, but certainly by 68 when he was campaigning actively, there was the new Nixon campaigning, and it continued on. When I went to the White House, the White House staff really, the Nixon they knew, excepting for a very few intimates, was the public Nixon. And a lot of time, as one now, somebody who's been into the archives to look around, was spent on presenting a different image of Nixon than people had. Tricky Dick was gone. There was a new man, a senior statesman who wanted peace, had a secret plan to obtain it. Of course, that's all was baloney, as we now know, when the tapes reveal. The White House counsel, you said you knew him, was and still is pretty much a middle-level staff job. I had two superiors, actually three I reported to. My predecessor, John Ehrlichman, never took his foot off my shoulder. He gave up the title, but he kept the job in many regards. I start my last book I found a great quote from Alex Butterfield, who understood really the organizational setup of the White House from a management standpoint, probably better than most. And he testified in front of the impeachment inquiry, and he said that literally he didn't think that the president even knew who I was. He recognized my name, but he had no dealings with me, which was pretty accurate. At the time Alex made the statement, Alex was on his way out as Nixon was just discovering me. He finds me 8 months in after the arrest at the Watergate. And the reason I start dealing with Nixon is because he wants Haldeman and Ehrlichman, his chief of staff and top domestic advisor, to be redesigning his second term, to find new personnel to replace people and shuffle people around and move them to different departments and agencies to try to energize the second term, as well as develop new policies. And so rather than I was reporting what I was learning to them, the way I became the linchpin of the conspiracy, if you will, is that after I took that confession from Liddy and learned what had happened, within 24 hours of Liddy confessing to me, he does a similar confession to John Mitchell through two of his top aides, Fred LaRue and Bob Mardian, and tells them what he's been doing at the White House. And I actually thought initially that John Mitchell might step forward and say, listen, this happened on my watch. I'm responsible for it. The White House has nothing to do with this. I made a mistake. I brought a wild card in here in this fellow Liddy. Yes, I wanted him to collect intelligence. I had no idea he was going to do the crazy stuff he's done. But suddenly he's learned, as a result of, from Mardian and LaRue, after Liddy confesses to them on the 20th, that he's done crazy stuff that he calls the White House horrors at the White House. And Ehrlichman and Mitchell had a difficult relationship even before that. As something that happened back during the campaign, they were both, Mitchell was the campaign manager, Ehrlichman was the head of the advance operation. There was an unease there. After Watergate, there was a bitterness. Mitchell is convinced that they sent Liddy over to the re-election committee, nobody explaining the fact that they were getting him out of the White House because he was crazy and had done these absurd things. It was a bungled burglary at Ellsberg's office. He was always recommending something that was beyond the pale. And they just moved him out because he had finally shown that he was also deeply incompetent as well. So Mitchell is bitter, and there were times, and I'd worked with both, I had the trust of both of Ehrlichman and Mitchell. They would communicate to each other through me. It got to the point where there could be four of us in a room, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and myself, and Mitchell would turn and talk to me as if he were talking to Ehrlichman, and Ehrlichman would do the same, like they could barely communicate. So this is how I become the sort, picking up all this information and start communicating it back and forth. And initially not thinking I'm doing anything wrong. I mean, I'm the lawyer stuck in the middle, and here are two guys who can't talk. It's not until after I actually hear a Hunt tape demanding money and that I realize that this is no defense fund in the normal sense. It's a hush money fund is what it really is. And that's when I pull the law books out and find two provisions of the code I'd never heard of before, being 18 U.S.C. 1503, the obstruction statute, and 18 U.S.C. 371, the federal conspiracy statute. I learned about those the hard way. But anyway, from an organizational standpoint, it wasn't so easy to recognize that the tricky dick still was there in 1968 when he ran again. Over here, yes. You all have to tell me where we draw the line on time-wise. Another 5 minutes, okay. Yeah, there's a book that's coming out by a group of the question was about, in essence, Trump's mental condition. And there's a book coming out that is being written by a group of psychologists and psychiatrists who are not going to comply with what's called the Goldwater Rule. The Goldwater Rule came from the '64 campaign when a magazine called Fact Magazine did a poll of psychiatrists who were clearly left-leaning and didn't like Goldwater and thought he was insane, they would take remarks he would make in jest and say, oh, well, he was actually being serious when he said, let's toss a hydrogen bomb in the men's room at the Kremlin and things of that nature. They didn't take lightly. But anyway, as a result of the '64 campaign, the American Psychiatric Association issued what they called the Goldwater Rule, that no professional in their association would issue an opinion on the mental condition of any political candidate without personally interviewing and interacting with that person, in other words, just from observation. It's a rule that some feel that there's an exception to that's got to be violated, and that is when there are clear signs of danger in that they professionally recognize in the performance and behavior of a person, that they have a duty of disclosing that danger. Well, there's a group that is headed by a psychiatrist at Yale who have assembled a book who are going to warn us, and it's forthcoming and should be out, I think, in the next month or so. So I have no credentials to critique this. I do think the Goldwater Rule was misplaced. The senator brought a successful defamation lawsuit, made Supreme Court law as a result of suing Fact Magazine. Didn't care. It wasn't a question of making money on the case. It was just he was the kind of person who was going to straighten out and get the truth out there because there was certainly nothing mentally wrong with the man, and he was more than suitable to perform the offices. So a last question. Gentleman right here, yes.
Trump and Nixon, but what are glaring differences?
Interesting question. The question is, what are the glaring differences between Trump and Nixon? I say it's an interesting question because it was the next section of that I left out of the PowerPoint. So let's quickly go through them and wrap it up on this. Nixon's undergraduate was done at Whittier, and he had a law degree from Duke. When he came home from Duke, he went in the Navy, then would run for Congress, and then when in Congress, he would spend several years in the Senate before being selected as a vice presidential candidate, and actually served as president, acting president, during the Eisenhower administration. Became a student of the world and very familiar with the world in his travels and what have you. He was obviously a Supreme Court advocate. He argued cases in front of the Supreme Court, so he knew the system. He knew how the mechanics worked. He married the girl he fell in love with. He literally tracked her until she said yes. They had one of the surprises in listening to all the tapes I did is how lovely a relationship this man has with his wife and his daughters. I'm sure they were shocked when they heard some of these tapes because it wasn't the man that they knew, and you can sense this from the conversations. I don't think there's any question that Nixon was prepared and knew how to be president. It's just that he decided the dark side of him came out, and he used it. Trump went to Fordham. He went to New York military to secondary school, school not unlike this one, but of course a military school of Fordham, and then proudly to Wharton. His father started him in the top of the business and funded his early businesses, so he inherited. He got very active in the news business in New York. Had a pretty fast life in Manhattan, but he studied the world also. Is that a low blow? I guess it is. And was friendly with people in high office. and then started a family before he did this run. I sort of summed up the differences here. Nixon clearly had a knowledge of how government works. He was a congressman, senator, and vice president. He understood the presidency by experience, as well as studying it under Eisenhower, who was no softy in running that office, as one looks at that history. Nixon had an expertise in foreign affairs. He was well-read, especially history, and on the presidency. Very introverted, low-keyed, uncomfortable with people, which is unusual for a public person. Trump has no knowledge of how government works, no prior public office. And this isn't to be pejorative, it's just to be explanatory, and I think the record's clear. He certainly knows the real estate business. He knows branding. He inherited wealth from his father and studied well under his father. He has no expertise in foreign affairs whatsoever. He's not well read. In fact, he doesn't like books. He's not a student of history, rather watches television and cable news as his principal source. He's extroverted, flashy, and comfortable with people. To me, he's the most unqualified man to ever become president. So with that, I'm going to close and thank you all for your time.